No one expected a man in worn boots and a dusty jacket to walk into one of the most exclusive steakhouses in New York City. But when he did, the entire evening took a turn no one saw coming. From the moment he stepped through the door, silent judgments were made, assumptions were whispered, and one waitress decided exactly how far she could push him. What she didn't know, and what shocked everyone, was who he really was. Crestview Steakhouse stood proudly in the heart of Manhattan, a beacon of wealth, status, and exclusivity. Its reputation wasn't built on the food alone, though the dry-aged Wagyu and tableside truffle service were legendary. No, Crestview was where New York's elite gathered to see and be seen. The air carried a quiet hum of power, from whispered business deals to the delicate clink of crystal wine glasses. Every detail, from the polished marble floors to the gold-etched menus, reminded guests that this was a place for the right kind of people, or so it seemed. But that illusion was about to be shattered. Tonight, Crestview's unspoken rules of appearance and class would be tested like never before. Inside Crestview Steakhouse, everything gleamed with quiet opulence. The polished mahogany bar stretched across the far wall, lined with rare single malts and vintage bourbons that cost more than some people's rent. Crystal chandeliers cast a soft golden glow over the room, reflecting off polished silverware and hand-blown glass candle holders. Every table was a picture of understated elegance: crisp white tablecloths, fresh flowers, and leather-bound menus, embossed with the restaurant's iconic crest. It wasn't just the decor that made Crestview famous. It was the clientele. Wealth wasn't just expected here, it was assumed. Regulars included corporate executives, entertainment moguls, and old money families, whose names were etched into Manhattan history. These were the kinds of people whose tailored suits and designer dresses were chosen as carefully as their investment portfolios. Guests drifted in that evening, their laughter low and polished, their movements graceful and practiced. Conversations floated through the air, murmured discussions of hedge funds, mergers, and art auctions, peppered with names only recognizable to those in the know. It was a place where your appearance spoke before you ever opened your mouth, and where how you looked often mattered more than who you were. At the host stand stood Olivia Carrington, one of Crestview's longest-serving staff members. Raised in privilege herself, Olivia had long ago decided it was her personal mission to protect the restaurant's refined image. She didn't just greet guests. She evaluated them, silently deciding whether they belonged. For Olivia, a guest's shoes, watch, and even posture told her everything she thought she needed to know. That's why, when the door swung open and Anthony Grant stepped inside, her lips curved into a smile, but her eyes held something else entirely. His worn jeans, dusty work boots, and slightly wrinkled shirt clashed against the room's curated perfection. To Olivia, he was out of place before he'd even spoken a word. The air grew heavier, subtle but unmistakable, as Olivia's judgment settled around him, like an invisible cloud. No words had been spoken, yet the first seed of silent discrimination had already been planted. The cool evening air followed Anthony Grant into the foyer, a faint trace of sawdust still clinging to his jacket from the day's work. His boots scuffed slightly against the marble floor, an unintentional contrast to the soft footfalls of polished loafers and designer heels around him. Anthony took in the room with a quiet, unassuming gaze. He had dined in places like this before, but tonight, he wasn't here as Chef Grant, or an award-winning culinary visionary. Tonight, he was just a tired man grabbing dinner after a long shift, and to anyone watching, that's all they saw. At the hostess stand, Olivia Carrington's practiced smile faltered just slightly the moment she noticed him. It was subtle, the briefest flicker of disapproval in her eyes, but it was there. Her trained instincts told her he didn't belong. The faded jeans, the worn leather boots, the slightly wrinkled flannel shirt, they clashed with the curated elegance of Crestview. She didn't know who he was, and that was part of the problem. At Crestview, the right people were recognized instantly. They didn't need introductions. Anyone who had to announce themselves was already suspect. "Are you sure you're in the right place, sir?" Olivia's voice was soft but pointed. Her smile stretched just a little too tight. She didn't shout or sneer. Her discrimination was quieter than that, coated in politeness so thin it was almost transparent. Anthony's smile never wavered. "I'm exactly where I want to be," he said, his voice calm, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are. The answer seemed to unsettle Olivia, who hesitated just a beat too long before reaching for a menu. Even as she led him toward the dining room, Her posture stayed stiff, her steps clipped, as if escorting a guest she wasn't quite sure deserved to be there. As Anthony followed her, the room itself seemed to shift. Conversations softened, curious glances flicked his way, and in those first silent moments, the invisible wall between appearance and worth was already rising. Olivia Carrington led Anthony Grant through the heart of Crestview Steakhouse, weaving between tables where high-end conversation floated effortlessly above plates of dry-aged steaks and crystal wine glasses. Every guest seemed to fit the mold. Men in tailored suits, women in understated yet expensive evening wear, their jewelry catching the soft candlelight. Everything about them whispered wealth and the quiet confidence that comes with belonging. But Anthony, to Olivia, he was a disruption. A man whose boots had walked through dust instead of polished floors, whose hands had likely held tools instead of fountain pens. She glanced back at him more than once, her subtle frown returning every time she took in his worn flannel shirt and the faint crease lines around his sleeves. Instead of guiding him to one of the desirable tables near the front, the spots where regulars lingered over $100 cocktails and steak tartare, Olivia kept walking. Past the tables set beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers, past the corner banquettes reserved for high-profile clients, until they reached a small, narrow table tucked against the far wall. The table was near the kitchen doors, where the occasional clang of pots and sharp voices of the line cooks spilled through each time they swung open. The air was warmer there, the quiet elegance of the dining room replaced by the faint smell of cleaning solution. The table itself was slightly smaller than the rest, its position leaving Anthony with a view of the server's station instead of the panoramic windows overlooking the city. Olivia placed the menu on the table with just a bit too much force, the leather cover thudding softly against the polished wood. Her voice was sugar-sweet, but the meaning underneath was bitter. "This should suit you just fine," she said, her smile never touching her eyes. Anthony's expression never changed. He simply took his seat, his calm gaze slowly sweeping the room. He could feel it, the subtle shift in energy, the sideways glances, the quiet judgment hanging in the air. Without a word, the first unspoken line between who belonged and who didn't had been drawn. Anthony settled into the cramped table. Olivia had chosen for him, the uneven leg wobbling slightly beneath his hand. The soft clang of pots and bursts of laughter from the kitchen broke through the air each time the swinging door creaked open. Servers darted past him, balancing trays of steak tartare and freshly shucked oysters, none of them offering so much as a glance in his direction. He could feel it. The quiet invisibility that came when someone decided you didn't belong. Olivia's decision to seat him by the kitchen wasn't just about space. It was a message. Crestview wasn't for people who looked like they'd spent the day on a construction site. It was for people with reservations booked weeks in advance and last names that carried weight. A few nearby diners had taken notice. At the next table, a middle-aged man in a crisp navy suit arched a brow, his gaze flicking over Anthony's boots before leaning toward his wife with a whisper. Across the room, a younger woman in a sleek black dress, Sarah, celebrating her promotion, caught the exchange and frowned slightly. She didn't know who Anthony was, but she knew unfairness when she saw it. Olivia returned a moment later, her smile polite but thin, her voice just a touch too loud. "Would you like to see the casual menu, sir? We have some simpler dishes, burgers, maybe a salad." Anthony's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table, but his expression stayed calm, unreadable. "I'd like to see the full menu," he replied, his voice smooth and steady. There was no edge to his words, no anger, no confrontation, just a simple request delivered with a quiet confidence Olivia couldn't quite place. It unsettled her more than any argument would have. She lingered for a second too long, waiting for a sign of hesitation, a crack in his composure that never came. When none appeared, she turned sharply, her heels clicking against the polished wood as she walked away. Anthony's calm refusal to be diminished had already shifted the air. Even before the first course arrived, the quiet battle for dignity had begun. As Anthony settled into his seat, the weight of unspoken judgment pressed against his shoulders like the low hum of background music. It wasn't loud, but it was there, in the way conversations at nearby tables slowed just enough to accommodate furtive glances in his direction, in the subtle tilt of a wine glass when someone pretended not to notice him. The message was clear. He was the unexpected element in an otherwise curated evening. At a corner table near the windows, Franklin Whitaker, a retired investment banker, observed the scene with a detached curiosity. His wife, Eleanor, wasn't so detached. She recognized the quiet insult Olivia had delivered. The table by the kitchen, the way she didn't offer him the same practiced warmth she reserved for other guests. Eleanor's brows knit together, and her fingers curled slightly around the stem of her wine glass. "Do you see what she's doing?" she whispered to Franklin. Franklin shrugged, his tone low. "It's not our business." Across the room, Sarah, the young woman in the black dress, couldn't seem to look away. She was celebrating a promotion at her marketing firm, but her mind kept drifting back to the man at the back table. There was something about his stillness, the way he held himself, even after being treated like an outsider, that made her chest tighten with quiet frustration. Her date, a man named Greg, followed her gaze and shook his head. "He's probably in the wrong place," Greg muttered. "Happens all the time." But Sarah wasn't so sure. At the service station near the kitchen, Daniel, a server in training, caught the entire exchange. He'd been taught to read the room, to sense when something wasn't quite right, and every instinct told him that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a test. Anthony, meanwhile, remained calm, his fingertips tracing the edge of the menu Olivia had finally left on the table. His silence wasn't resignation. It was a choice. A quiet, deliberate refusal to shrink under the weight of assumption. All around him the diners watched, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, but none willing to speak. Not yet. The subtle discomfort swirling around Anthony's table began to take shape the moment Olivia returned. This time she didn't even bother with the polite smile. Her expression hovered somewhere between strained professionalism and barely concealed contempt. She held her notepad loosely at her side, her eyes flicking over Anthony's worn shirt and boots like they were personal offenses. "Have you had a chance to look at the menu?" Her voice carried just a little louder than necessary, ensuring nearby tables could hear. Anthony nodded, his calm smile unwavering. "I'll have the Wagyu ribeye medium rare, and a glass of the silver oak cabernet." The order landed like a dropped plate in the middle of the room. Olivia's brow lifted so high it nearly touched her hairline. Her laugh was soft, but loud enough to be heard at the neighboring tables. "That steak's $325, she said, her tone thick with doubt. "Just wanted to make sure you saw the price." At the table near the window, Eleanor Whitaker's lips parted slightly in quiet shock. Across the room, Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes flicking from Anthony to Olivia, watching the small humiliations stack one on top of the other. Anthony didn't flinch. "Sounds perfect," he said, voice steady, posture relaxed, as though he ordered meals like this every night, which in truth, he could have if he'd wanted. The simplicity of his response seemed to rattle Olivia even more. She lingered for a beat too long, waiting for him to change his mind, or ask for something cheaper. When he didn't, her smirk faded into something sharper, a mix of annoyance and disbelief. Without another word, she spun on her heel, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood as she walked away. Anthony leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly through his nose, aware of every pair of eyes watching him. He could feel the tension rippling outward, seeping into conversations and silences alike. What Olivia didn't realize, not yet, was that the calmest man in the room was also the one holding all the power. As Olivia disappeared into the kitchen, the air around Anthony's table grew heavier. Conversations continued at nearby tables, but the easy flow of laughter and wine-fueled banter had thinned, replaced by the uneasy awareness that something was off. Anthony sat calmly, his fingers lightly tracing the edge of his menu, but the stillness of his posture only seemed to magnify the tension. His quiet confidence clashed with the expectation Olivia had set, the expectation that someone who looked like him would shrink under the weight of her disapproval. But Anthony didn't shrink. Minutes ticked by. Servers floated past, refilling water glasses at other tables, offering wine pairings and fresh bread. Not one paused at Anthony's table. His water glass sat empty, the basket of bread nowhere to be seen. At the front of the room, Olivia leaned against the bar, her arms crossed, her voice low as she whispered to another server, her eyes flicking toward Anthony more than once. The unspoken message was clear. This man doesn't deserve our attention. Anthony noticed every slight, every omission. He said nothing, but inside, the weight of familiar prejudice settled like an old, unwanted companion. The tension at Anthony's table had almost become its own presence, stretching across the dining room like an invisible line everyone could feel, but no one dared to cross. The silence surrounding him spoke louder than words ever could. Olivia's absence dragged on, each passing minute Another quiet confirmation that Anthony was meant to feel unwanted. But then the kitchen door swung open, and a familiar voice sliced through the hum of conversation. Anthony Grant. What a surprise. Heads turned as Gerald Holloway, Crestview's general manager, strode into the dining room, his expression a mix of excitement and alarm. His outstretched hand cut through the air, reaching for Anthony's, in a gesture of eager respect. Olivia froze near the bar, her smile vanishing in an instant. The room itself seemed to inhale. Every guest who had quietly judged the man at the back table now watched as the truth settled in. The man they assumed was out of place was in fact one of the most respected chefs in the country. Anthony stood slowly, his grip firm but polite, his calm smile never wavering. For Olivia and everyone else, the moment of reckoning had arrived. As Anthony shook Gerald Holloway's hand, the weight in the room shifted. The quiet murmur of silverware against porcelain faded, replaced by an awkward silence, the kind that only happens when people realize they've misjudged someone. Anthony's calm smile never faltered, but there was no mistaking the message in his eyes. He knew exactly what had been happening since the moment he walked through the door. He turned slightly, his voice low but clear enough to reach every corner of the room. It's funny, he said, his tone even and steady. I've spent my career teaching young chefs that a person's worth isn't measured by their title or their clothes. He let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. That lesson doesn't just apply to kitchens. It applies to every place where people gather, including restaurants like this. Olivia stood frozen near the bar, her arms stiff at her sides. Every slight remark, every dismissive glance, every time she chose to serve someone else first, it all hung in the air, reflected back at her, in Anthony's calm but unmistakable authority. Anthony's voice softened. Respect shouldn't depend on appearances. It's the one thing everyone deserves. Anthony's words didn't just hang in the air. They cut through the room like a cold breeze, making people shift uncomfortably in their seats. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it left no doubt that he was speaking to more than just Olivia. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the tables, landing on the faces of diners who had stolen glances at him. Some with curiosity, others with silent judgment. It's easy to treat someone well when they look like they belong, Anthony said. But true hospitality, true decency, shows in how you treat someone when you're not sure if they do. At the corner table, Eleanor Whitaker lowered her eyes, embarrassed by her own silence. Across the room, Sarah shifted in her chair, feeling both vindicated and ashamed for not saying something earlier. Anthony didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence, his story, and his unshakable calm had already forced everyone in the room to confront what they'd silently allowed. This isn't about me, he added quietly. It's about who we all choose to be when no one's watching. The room stayed silent, the lesson sinking in. For a moment the only sound in the dining room was the soft clink of a glass being set down. Olivia stood near the bar, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her knuckles pale from the pressure. Her mind raced, replaying every dismissive glance, every delayed service, every assumption she had made about Anthony from the second he walked through the door. Her throat felt tight, but she forced herself to step forward. "Mr. Grant," she said softly, her voice cracking slightly. I'm so sorry." Anthony turned, his expression calm but unreadable. He didn't relish her discomfort, nor did he want to humiliate her. That wasn't the point. "I appreciate the apology," Anthony said, his tone kind but firm. "But the real question is how you'll treat the next guest who doesn't fit your expectations." His words weren't just for Olivia, they were for the whole room. Servers, diners, even Gerald Holloway stood a little straighter, realizing this night wasn't just about one man being judged. It was about a culture that had silently allowed it. Anthony offered Olivia a small nod, a quiet sign that growth was possible, if she chose it. Anthony stepped out into the cool New York night, the heavy door of Crestview closing softly behind him. The hum of the city wrapped around him, but his mind stayed inside that dining room, where uncomfortable silence had settled over linen-draped tables and half-finished meals. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded anything, yet the lesson he left behind was unmistakable. Respect doesn't belong to a privileged few. It's owed to everyone, no matter how they look, or where they come from. As Anthony walked down the sidewalk, his worn boots meeting polished pavement, he knew the real question wasn't whether they'd remember him. It was whether they'd remember the moment they saw themselves, and chose to do better. This story isn't just about a man in a restaurant, It's about the quiet prejudices that still shape how we treat people every day. In a world where appearances often speak louder than words, it's easy to assume someone's worth based on their clothes, their job, or even the way they enter a room. But respect shouldn't be reserved for the wealthy or the well-dressed. It's a basic kindness everyone deserves.